Deputy President, I presume that doesn't mean I can speak for up to that period of time. I'm sure you'll correct me. But can I just say how much I've really enjoyed this debate and want to commend Stuart McMillan, not just for securing debate, but for giving a really fine speech to open this debate and set a really balanced tone to the way that we're discussing this. I would like to talk about my love of history. I love history. And the reason I love history is because inspirational teachers imbued me with a love of history. And it's true that there probably aren't enough classroom hours to cover the curriculum that was outlined by Kenny Gibson. But it is possible to inspire young people to leave a classroom with a desire to know more by doing their own research. And I think that was part of what Martin Whitfield was saying in his speech, which I also enjoyed greatly. I have to say, by the way, that my love of history is entirely amateur, unlike my colleague, Murdo Fraser, who is a professional because he's receiving fees from his royalties from his book, which apparently is available on Amazon. Do you want me to repeat that? That's a gratuitous advertisement. But when we're celebrating Scotland's history, we really must be careful, as has been pointed out by a number of speakers, not to examine it solely through the lenses of nostalgia or ideology. This is particularly true, of course, when it comes to teaching history in schools. We must encourage pupils to have a broad and critical understanding of our history as they study history, to ask the searching and difficult questions about our past, emphasising the importance of creating as accurate a picture as possible based on bona fide research and historical evidence. Sadly, I fear the way that history is sometimes being taught in our schools does not live up to this standard. And I wish to return to the theme that my colleague Murdo Fraser mentioned earlier, quoting the same source, Neil McLennan, the senior lecturer, and of course I will.
Minister. The member could name a specific school where he has such concerns.
No,
Stephen Kerr.
I think it would be wholly improper of me in this debating chamber to entertain such a question. However, nationalist nostalgia and ideology are increasingly seeping into the curriculum, creating a one-sided and inaccurate representation of our shared history. I mentioned earlier that I am going to quote from Neil McLennan, Senior Lecturer and Director of Leadership Programmes at the University of Aberdeen. And the example of the slave trade was already cited by Murdo Fraser. I'm going to quote exactly what he says. If you read guidance from the SQA, the curriculum gives examples of slave ports like Liverpool and Bristol, but the slave trade wasn't solely centred on England. And it goes on, McLennan asks for Glasgow to be inserted. Of course I will.
Kenneth Gibson.
When I was in secondary school, we never get 1 hour of Scottish history, so it was bound to be focused on Bristol and Liverpool and the slave trade. But in actual fact, we didn't have the slave trade at secondary school, but we did get, as I said in my speech, the tobacco lords and the slave trade when I was at primary school 50 years ago.
Well, with the
Stephen Kerr.
I think we're about the same vintage, so I'm not going to say anything insulting here, but I'm talking about the current curriculum, not the one that you and I probably went through. And he has asked for Glasgow to be inserted, but this hasn't happened. And asked why, in the newspaper article reported in the Herald on Sunday, McLennan said, is it because the system is so bureaucratic, even minor reforms are too hard to do? That's very worrying, if so, he says. Is it because of power balances, that those in coveted positions don't fancy those changes? Or is it because of a underbelly of parochialism linked to nationalism, where those changes are unpalatable? Of course I will.
Stuart McMillan.
I thank Mr Kerr for taking the intervention. I'm quite sure that when Mr Kerr heard my opening contribution, I couldn't have been any stronger in terms of what we need to do in terms of the transatlantic slave trade. Now, I did read the same article that Mr Kerr has done, but I'm sure that Mr Kerr would also acknowledge that my contribution in this debate and how I set this debate out, that there's no narrow nationalism, there's no imperialism, none of that nonsense. That was about having education, it was about having history, so that we can educate our present and future generations so they know warts and all what Scotland was like in the past.
Stephen Kerr, I can give you most of that time back.
Oh, right. Thank you very much, Deputy President. Actually, this is not the first time that Stuart McMillan and I have had an exchange like this in this chamber. And I recognise what I'm saying is not necessarily representative of the feelings of every nationalist, let alone every member of the SNP that sits in this chamber. I accept that. But within the nationalist movement, there is a fear that presenting a more accurate representation of Scotland's history will create a negative narrative. And some even go as far as to describe this as talking Scotland down. And I'm sorry, but I'm sure that Stuart McMillan and I would agree with this, that is plain nonsense.
Stuart McMillan, very briefly,
It's
please.
a very brief one. Yes. Mr Kerr, I'm not arguing for a more accurate, I'm just arguing for an accurate version of history.
Stephen Kerr.
I take that point entirely, and I'm not ascribing these views to any particular member in this chamber tonight. Deputy Presiding Officer, I'm way over time. I can tell that I will wear your patience even thinner. So let me conclude by saying we have a proud history, but not a perfect one. We should take pride from our many achievements as Scots, but also learn from our mistakes. Not only will this present a more accurate picture of Scotland's past, but will aid us in our aim to develop Scotland in the present for the better.